Welcome everyone to my latest Skyrim build, once again on the legendary difficulty setting. I will say straight off that I don't normally play as a vampire in Skyrim, so this build took a hell of a lot of playtesting to get it to work. So if you enjoy it, then don't forget to leave behind a like, and possibly share it too, as it really does help me out. Without any more delay, let's get on to the build. Growing up on Somerset Isle, the High Elf was raised in a wealthy family. He had a private tutor to teach him all manner of subjects, ranging from the history of his people to the magical arts. His innate magical abilities alongside his teachings made him a powerful sorcerer at an incredibly young age, even for one of his race. He had a particular fondness for illusion magic, preferring subtle spells to the more overt ones that many other schools of magic contained. Despite his life of riches, he still felt himself wishing for more. He could ask for anything he wanted, and yet he still felt that something was missing from his life. In an attempt to find something to fill the void, he left his home, sailing across the sea and travelling to Cyrodiil. As he starts his journey, he travels far and wide across the land, before coming across a group of wandering mages. After demonstrating his arcane skill, they allow him to travel with them for a time, eventually crossing over the border into High Rock. The group told him that they were taking him to their home, and the High Elf was eager to learn of the place the mages had come from. They were an interesting group, far different from the mages he had met back at home, possessing amazing talents and yet not having to flaunt them for people to be able to know their power. When they reached their home, the elf was taken aback. The group all seemed of humble origin, and yet the sight before him was of a huge manor house, one even to rival the home in which he had been raised. He was given a room to himself for the night and gladly fell into the bed, grateful for something comfortable to sleep on after so many rough nights on the road. He awoke suddenly from his slumber, feeling a sharp pain in his neck. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw that one of the mages had buried their teeth inside of him. Pulling away from the mage showed them to be long fangs, more similar to a beast than any man or mer. He tries to flee out of the room, but the mage stops him with supernatural speed, striking him down to the ground and tearing open the wound in his neck. The Outmer grabs hold of a nearby candlestick and swings it at the man looming over him, catching the mage's robes with the flame. Fear entered the mage's eyes, and he frantically began to pat away the fire. Reacting to this new knowledge, the elf remembered back to his training and summoned forth fire from his hands, searing the mage and keeping him at bay as he left the room. He didn't want to stay around to see if any of the other mages were hostile towards him or not, and instead stayed as light on his feet as possible, finding an exit to the house and fleeing as fast as his feet could carry him once outside. He ran until his legs could carry him no longer, collapsing at the side of a road. His adrenaline was starting to run out, and he became acutely aware of the blood loss he had suffered from the bite. His vision was fading, and he was starting to lose consciousness. But he had a vague feeling that someone had starting to carry him forwards. The next thing he could remember after this was lying in a straw bed and drinking hot soup while a strange feeling washed over him. He had a few vague memories of his time, but his next clear one was of waking up in the woods, covered in blood and with no idea where he was. Walking up a nearby hill, he saw the smouldering ruins of a village, and something in his heart told him that this was his fault. Despite not knowing what had happened, the elf decided that he should leave the place at once. He runs into a lone traveller on the road and spends the night with them, asking for directions and seeking some semblance of normality. That night though, an insatiable hunger comes over him, and he finds himself with his teeth sunk into the traveller's neck, draining every ounce of his blood and leaving his pale and lifeless corpse at the roadside. It is at this point that he realises what has happened to him. He has become a vampire, and now must feed off of others to sustain his own life. Knowing that he can't return home, he will instead travel towards Skyrim, hoping to find somewhere in the mountains to hide away, and keep both himself and others safe. Fate has something different in store for him, however, and he will be forced to accept his new life in time. The main skills of this build are Illusion and Sneak. Both of these will work together to make you as stealthy as possible. In the Illusion skill tree you will be focusing on getting to Expert Illusion and Quiet Casting, to make all your spells silent, and in the Sneak tree you will want to work your way up to the Assassin's Blade, for a 15 times sneak attack multiplier with daggers. Realistically, these are the only two skills you need to make this build work, so focus on leveling them as fast as you possibly can, and don't forget to utilise skill trainers at the early levels. The additional skills I have for this build are Speech and One-Handed. Speech is here partially for practicality and partially for roleplaying. The Vampire Lord is quite a persuasive individual, who others have a tendency to take a liking to, and a high speech helps to represent this. Practically, it helps us to make more gold from buying and selling, and this in turn helps us buy skill training for the two skills we do need. The One-Handed skill is here purely to add a bit of extra damage to our weapons. Only put perks into Armsman, as nothing else is needed. This is a very low level build, considering how strong it can be, but once you have the build in place, you can then expand it as you like afterwards. As a standing stone for this build, I would recommend initially going for the Action Arc Stone. The extra buff to Magika complements the bonus you get from being a high elf, and will help us cast plenty of illusion spells, even at the early levels. Later on you will likely not need the extra Magika however, so I would instead recommend either the Ritual Stone or the Serpent Stone, depending on your stealth skills. If you've been struggling to stay hidden when playing, then go for the Ritual Stone, and use it to either create a distraction or to summon an undead horde to your side. If you're finding that you can sneak around enemies with ease, instead go for the Serpent Stone, in order to be able to instantly paralyse an enemy once a day. This can be great if you're running low on Magika or didn't notice an additional enemy and need to quickly put them out of action. In addition to the powers granted by the Serpent and Ritual Stones, don't forget to use your racial ability of Highborn when needed, for some incredible Magika regeneration. You do also have the Vampire Lord form, which can come in handy for direct confrontations. Although powerful, don't grow overconfident in this mode, as you can still be slain relatively easily by a single powerful enemy, or a group of weaker ones, so make sure to fight smart in this form. Try to level up your vampiric powers early on against weak enemies, so that you stand a better chance when it comes to a difficult fight. In such a fight, you will have to rely on your enhanced mobility to outmaneuver your opponent. The Bat's power works particularly well for this, essentially letting you teleport a short distance. You will want to get your hands on a powerful dagger when playing this character. I would personally recommend the Blade of Woe or Mehrunes Razor. The Blade of Woe has the highest base damage, and the Absorb Health enchantment is a nice added touch, but it does run out of charge fairly quickly. Mehrunes Razor on the other hand won't have to be recharged, and the chance for an instant kill can potentially save you in an unexpected situation, even if it can't be relied upon. I would also recommend using Harkened Sword and travelling with a bow of your choice. Neither of these weapons should be used if it can be avoided, but at some point you may need a tiny bit more power or versatility at your side, so it's worth having them. The armour for this build is Vampire Royal Armour, a shrouded hood, shrouded gloves, and vampire boots. Vampire Royal Armour not only looks great, but gives a huge increase to Magika regeneration, allowing us to always have a supply to cast spells with. The shrouded hood is not the most aesthetically pleasing piece of equipment, and I do prefer the character without it on, but it gives a bonus to sneaking, which can come in handy very early on. The shrouded gloves are an essential part of a loadout. With these equipped, our sneak attack damage with daggers goes up from 15 times to 30 times. This huge increase lets us one-hit kill all but the toughest of enemies, and even if we can't one-hit an enemy, we can still knock a decent chunk of their health off in a single strike. Vampire boots are here purely for the aesthetic, but feel free to enchant them as you see fit if you want a small buff of some form. In addition, I also wore the Ring of the Erudite and the Necromancer Amulet when playing. The Ring of the Erudite is great for our Magika supply, and is granted through doing side missions for the Volkihar vampires. If you're playing as a vampire who uses magic, then you want this ring. The Necromancer Amulet is one that doesn't actually help us out that much. The extra Magika is nice, but by no means essential. The reduction in health and stamina regeneration don't affect us too much, as we already have that penalised for being a vampire, so the downside isn't too big of a deal. I personally decided to wear this as I was thinking about heading into Conjuration later on with the build, but it wasn't really necessary. If you do want to take this build further, then the Conjuration is a good secondary skill to have, as you can silently reanimate the dead or summon action arcs. The main faction for this build will be the Volkihar Vampires. Joining this side will grant us the Vampire Lord power, one of the strongest powers in the game, and something that is of incredible use to the build. It also ensures we become a vampire, something essential for the roleplaying of the build, as before you join them you will likely just have to roleplay that the Vampire Lord is trying to suppress his powers, as he is still adjusting to his new life. The additional faction for this build will be the Dark Brotherhood. We need to join up with them for the purposes of getting the right gear, but they also work as a good way to signify the Vampire Lord slowly accepting his path on the dark side. He will start off by killing Grelod to help out innocent children, then is forced to kill by someone else, and slowly will grow to embrace it as the last of his humanity fades away. You will want to avoid travelling with a follower whenever you can. As you can see from my footage, having a follower with you can really mess up your stealth. Thanks to the Vampire Lord form, we don't have to rely purely on stealth, but we are vulnerable when switching between forms, so don't be too bold. Admittedly, having a follower can come in handy if you do get discovered, but I would still advise against it. The Vampire Lord is an illusion-based assassin. You will want to cast Muffle and then Invisibility in order to make yourself undetectable. Then sneak up behind an unsuspecting enemy and slice their throat open. If done right, you should be able to wipe out entire outposts without ever being seen, but things can go wrong. Depending on the situation, you have a couple of plans to fall back on. The first is to use illusion magic to manipulate your enemies. If a lone enemy has spotted you, then calming them can often lead to you regaining your hidden status, without alerting anyone else. If you've been noticed by a large group, then a quick frenzy spell comes in handy for sowing chaos and switching the focus away from you. Alternatively, you can switch to the Vampire Lord form. This is a bit risky though. Although once you become a Vampire Lord you are very powerful, the transformation stage does leave you vulnerable, and I died a few times whilst transforming, so make sure you're relatively safe before doing this. Once in vampire form, navigate your way through enemies, and use all the powers at your disposal to create chaos and slaughter those around you. For roleplaying, I suggest starting this build off as a morally good character, before turning more evil. As I mentioned in the factions section, you can turn more evil over time, and I always feel that this makes for a more interesting character, and also leaves open more options for you. Thanks to all of you for watching this build through to the final minutes, and I sincerely hope that you enjoyed it. As I said earlier, I don't normally play as a vampire, so let me know what you thought of this build and leave any tips for me in the comments. I do know that you can use the Necromage perk in the Restoration tree for a whole bunch of added bonuses, but I've never liked the fact that every vampire build I've ever seen relied on it, so I chose to forgo it in favour of a really simple, yet incredibly powerful build. Make sure to give the video a like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, and maybe check out some of my other great builds too.